I want to talk about two lightweight symmetric block ciphers as a transition from our breakdown on encryption algorithms to some of the policy and real world implications of cryptography. IoT devices need encryption too, and they can't have some of the encryption algorithms that we've been talking about because AES and RSA and ECC are pretty compute heavy compared to what you might need for relatively small embedded IoT style devices. Because of this, there was a call for approaches to designing lightweight algorithms, one for something that would be implemented in hardware and one that would be implemented in software. And that's where we get Simon and Speck. Both of these were designed by the NSA. And this link is to an article that's required reading for this class. The big question is, what do you think the world would say to encryption algorithms designed by the National Security Agency in the United States? Well, it was basically exactly what you would imagine. The International Standards Organization has rejected these algorithms as possible standards, basically because they just don't trust the NSA. And I think that's a fair assessment from a worldwide perspective. It's very difficult to imagine if it was not the U.S. National Security Agency, but say an Israeli organization or a Chinese organization or a Russian organization. It'd be very difficult to imagine a universal standard going in. So what we really want, and what we're going to need, are open standards for these two slots, for these two problems. Because the problems that they're trying to address here are real problems. You need encryption on embedded devices, you need encryption on IoT devices, and you need a good algorithm that's useful and implementable in hardware. You need a similar one that's useful and implementable in software. Without that, we're not going to be able to have the same kind of IoT revolution that everybody is expecting. So there's a real need here, but it's not going to be fulfilled by Simon and Speck. And that brings us to questions about government and encryption. The first crypto war, this should be the first crypto war. Let me correct that really quick. Was all about whether or not the government should allow backdoors or mandate backdoors for encryption algorithms. And there basically were two strong opinions on this. One saying, yes, this is a legitimate role for law enforcement. Prior to widespread strong encryption, law enforcement had access through essentially the regulatory infrastructure that had been built up since the 60s, since the Katz decision at the Supreme Court that we had talked about in the 2 lectures ago in the privacy lecture, where law enforcement was given access to this sort of stuff by the third party, right? Like AT&T or Verizon would give access to your communications data pursuant to a warrant or pursuant to a request dependent upon the level of access requested. And this is essentially allowing for that same sort of thing to happen if we were to mandate a crypto backdoor that the government would be able to use to get access. Arguments on the other side, essentially saying no, is crypto systems are really hard to build. They're very complex. And if you try and build a backdoor, that level of complexity, the added level of complexity, opens up problems and holes that have to be done perfectly right in order to make the crypto system secure. And because we know that there is no such thing as a perfect implementation, that adding a backdoor necessarily weakens, from an engineering and practical standpoint, the protection that's provided by these crypto systems. Right? That's an argument for no. Another argument for no is that crypto is a fundamental right, that we have a right to have protection over our conversations. This is, of course, a policy position rather than an engineering position to claim that crypto is a fundamental right. There is, however, I think, an important and adjacent position from a technical standpoint that this is just mathematics. And as soon as somebody has developed an open, available, widely compilable software system that implements this stuff, then it would be just as available as anything else, and you wouldn't necessarily be able to protect it. So, for example, if I were to download something like PGP, and if I were to set it up and use it with my friends, and everybody, if we all follow the proper procedures, that's a pretty strong crypto system, right? Especially if all I'm doing is using it for a local protection. So for example, I have a whole bunch of business records, I encrypt them using a long, strong password and an open algorithm. There's not an easy way for the government to mandate a backdoor into that kind of information, right? And so this is an argument essentially saying that if we're going to have people doing this anyway, then does the backdoor mandate really make all that much sense? Okay, all of these pushes for mandated crypto backdoors eventually came to a head in the debate over the Clipper chip, which was a proposal from the NSA to design a chipset that would be embedded into mobile phones. Remember, this is like happening in the mid-90s when mobile phones were first taking off. And the Clipper chip would essentially be that backdoor, would be a backdoor for the government to access anything that was happening on that phone. And this ultimately ended up devolving into a very loud shouting debate in terms of policy between these two camps. The law enforcement camp saying, yes, we need this, and the sort of like complexity engineering technologist camp saying, no, we don't. And eventually, the argument became untenable for the government when Matt Blaze and a number of other academic researchers found multiple vulnerabilities from the law enforcement access field, the LEAF field, and other problems with the chips that made the engineering design that had been proposed by the NSA fundamentally problematic and difficult to implement. So that particular proposal died, but I think it may be worth thinking of this as the first crypto battle rather than the first crypto war, because even though the technologists arguing in favor of not building the system because of the complexity, even though they won that argument, they haven't ended the debate. The second crypto war basically started when Apple resisted a government request to provide access to iPhones that were owned by or used by the two terrorists who attacked San Bernardino a couple of years ago. And essentially, the second crypto war takes a similar shape as the first crypto war. Should the government have some way to mandate crypto backdoors for popular technology systems? In this particular case, it was more like, should Apple or Google actually be required to break their own phones or their own operating systems in order to allow access for law enforcement investigation purposes? And of course, some senators, illiterate senators, proposed bills that would basically outlaw strong encryption anywhere, which is kind of crazy because commerce depends upon our ability to have encrypted channels to provide goods and services online. So that level of access is never going to happen. But the notion of whether or not we should have some sort of easy way for the government to get access through a legitimately installed crypto system on something like an iPhone is still very much up for debate. I don't think this is going to be an answered question anytime soon. It seems like these two sides are kind of stuck at loggerheads for now. But it is a very important technology policy issue that you should be aware of. And the math behind crypto is pretty hard to get around. It's once you have a implementation that is remotely good, then the math makes it very, very difficult to imagine a scenario where you could comply with a law that mandated access to some pieces of information. I also want to say that from a technology policy standpoint, we're going to continue to see how security, privacy, and government collide in kind of weird ways. Throughout this class, I've touched on public policy and how it affects security as a result of that. And we'll talk a lot more about that next week, which is basically the subject of next week's lecture. But I wanted to, again, note here, software systems exist in the real world. People in the real world have to use laws and regulations and abide by laws and regulations for addressing social concerns. This includes notions of privacy and security and fairness and ethics and a whole host of other things, some of which are going to be key players in next week's lecture. For the sake of crypto, though, crypto is a mathematical theoretical tool, and it's going to be used in real-world situations that would be unfortunate from a policy standpoint. That doesn't necessarily mean that we need to eliminate any possible use of crypto, or it doesn't mean that we need to ensure every use of crypto has some sort of government oversight. The big question there is this trade-off, right? Are law enforcement offices going dark because people have access to really strong crypto, or is this a golden age for surveillance because everyone has a location tracker slash phone slash technology device on them at basically all times? Now, the textbook that I have here, or the book that's shown here, is very interesting. I don't know if this is a link or not. I guess it's not. PGP source code and internals, I think, this is a physical manifestation of the problems that we have had in terms of regulating intellectual property and technology policy over time. So just as a very brief aside, going all the way back to like that first crypto war where the government was first addressing this notion of crypto backdoors, Phil Zimmermann had created PGP in the United States, and it was classified, PGP was classified, all encryption algorithms were classified as munitions by the Commerce Department and the DoD, meaning that you could not export the technology outside of the country. So Commerce Department, DoD, and a number of other government organizations have lists of things that are classified as non-exportable because the secrecy of the material or the sensitivity of the material makes it such that if it were to get into the wrong hands, it would pose a national security threat. And in the mid-90s, encryption algorithms classified as that. So you could not, for example, just post the source code online and let somebody else download it in another country. Phil Zimmermann wanted to find a way to make PGP truly open source and available worldwide. And in order to do that, he decided to take the source code and print it in a textbook, print it in a book, which is this book that you're seeing here on the screen. Fly out of the country with a copy of the book because books are copyright protected and not subject to export regulations. And then when he got outside of the country, he cut all the pages out of the book, used some very early optical character recognition software, and scanned the source code back in to redigitize it once it was outside of the country. And that's how he was able to get a complete copy, a compilable copy of the PGP source code that had originally been developed in the United States outside of the country for the purposes of munitions controls. And it was all, of course, totally illegal because this is like the whole reason the law was created. And at that point, the strong crypto had escaped, the horse was out of the barn. It was no longer possible to make this argument that we were making in the original first crypto war that, yeah, we should just mandate it, and that if we did mandate it, then yes, they would have access. It turns out that strong crypto outside of the borders of the United States makes that sort of thing impossible. It was just math. It was bound to be invented, found, and implemented regardless. So long summary of things that we've covered in today's lecture and this week's material. I think the main thing to keep in mind is there's a little bit of technology and a little bit of math involved, but it is still very much all about how do we actually use this in the real world. The actual implementation and the actual practice around security remains the most important piece of the puzzle to building a strong, secure system. So we can think of like chaining and random initialization vectors and all that sort of stuff is important, but really the practice of implementing this stuff and maintaining it is much more of a factor in whether or not you actually have achieved security, right? And then the last thing I'll simply say is quantum cryptography, kind of an overblown, overhyped thing for now. It really isn't problematic because we don't have access to large crypto systems or large quantum computers that could break crypto systems. And we probably won't for another 8 to 10 years have anything that would be threatening for the vast majority of uses of encryption in today's world.